companies will often come in and say, okay, we want to do localization, but it's expensive and it takes too long. And all of these things sound great, but how can I do it without spending all my budget and time on localization? What are some of the things that we should be thinking about to reduce the costs and the effort of it?
I think it's almost counterintuitive, because when people think, oh, the translation costs too much, the localization costs too much, your first thought is to think, how can we reduce the costs at that stage? But often our advice to clients will be, we actually need to go back further in the process, go back to the beginning with how the content's authored, what features do you use, how scalable is it, to make sure that the English or the source content is designed in such a way that you can remove unnecessary cost or engineer out cost, so that your localization cost is significantly reduced, but you're still getting the same learner experience and you're not sacrificing on quality. There might be thoughts of, oh, let's just use machine translation, or we can change all our human voiceover to text-to-speech voice instead. And it's balancing those things against the learner experience and the impact that it has on them. But always our advice would be, if it costs too much or if it's too time consuming, look at the English first. Let's think, what can we do to improve that? And then look at the localization process as a secondary step.
So let's say that this company coming in does want to use machine translation, or does want to use these ways to reduce it, because they've heard that this is the way to make it cheaper.
Both machine translation and text-to-speech voiceover are really valid in some use cases, but it's really thinking about, is it right for me? That might be in terms of the content. So if your content is a manufacturing video showing somebody how to install a piece of equipment, that if there's an error, there might be a risk to life or somebody gets injured, we wouldn't recommend that be machine translated. The risk isn't worth it. It's often to do with volume of content as well. So if there are tens of thousands of words in your learning modules, then machine translation and post-editing or text-to-speech is often really valid. And I think there's more of an acceptance nowadays of text-to-speech voiceover. Certainly, it's improved in leaps and bounds in recent years. And I think we have a lot of clients who use text-to-speech rather than using voiceovers. It makes a huge difference to the cost on a project, but it's always that balance between cost and your learner experience.
So how can companies ensure that they're not wasting effort in translation? What are the kind of problems that occur if there is wasted effort?
I think it's usually, I mean, on our experience, it's usually the design maybe that's causing problems. You keep hitting roadblocks whenever planning for the launch of a new market or in a new company. And it's thinking about those potential launches when designing the course what is critical. It's simple things like font, text orientation and distribution, space, colors used, animations. Those can easily become roadblocks or increase the engineering costs down the line. So thinking about those when planning and when offering your content are essential. I think minimizing the multimedia to avoid those increase or more than increase unnecessary costs, because they are not really, you don't really need them. You can localize that content in a different way. And it's this like knowing is your what if you need to use those multimedia and those images, have I created them in the best way, or can they be localized effectively? And maybe, for example, for videos, rather than having a person doing a free video of some instructions, for example, you want to have an animation with a script that you know exactly what words the character is going to say. So that way it's more scalable, and you can easily localize some sections and just move them around in your modules. And I think that's also very useful when translating, because you don't have to think about like specific words that have to fit the mouth movement in a video. That's something that animations are very, very useful for. And it will, like, having an animation will also help the engineers move around the content. So for example, if some languages expand, like German, that is for example like 30%, has a rate of around 30% expansion, you will allow the engineer to expand that video and not have to reshoot or not have clunky spaces there of not movement for the voice.
Another example for video would be if you're doing a how-to video, for example. Often those videos have piece to camera, so somebody talking to the camera and you can see their face. Again, that's very hard to localize. People might know that that's not for them. The person isn't speaking their language, but you can remove that and you might just have shots that show somebody's hands doing the actual steps themselves. And something like that is much easier to localize, much cheaper to localize. So it's, again, engineering out all that extra effort that you're not really getting your money's worth from it. It's not value for money. And the same is true as well for the content itself. In all things localization, words cost money. So thinking about your written content and whether that can be made more concise, or if you're a large company that has a large corpus of learning material, look at it as a whole and think, how can we best reuse some of this? So an example is we did a set of modules for a client some years ago, and there were about 60 lessons. And at the start and at the end of each of the lessons, the narrator spoke to the learners and said, welcome to lesson number 1. In this lesson, we're going to go over this and this and this. And at the end, they would say, now you've completed lesson 42, and so on and so on and so on. And each of those clips of audio had to be revoiced in a number of different languages, and all of that cost money. And we worked with that client to make that content generic. So instead of saying the lesson number, you just say this lesson. And then we could record that once and reuse it in every module. And the same is true across content authored by different people as well. Be consistent in your wording and your phrasing, and you can benefit from translation memory, and you can reduce that effort as well.
I think if you're not sure, consult the LSP and they will advise you on pitfalls that you can avoid. If using our experience, there's a lot of things you can avoid.
And I think with e-learning as well, I think it's a really rapidly changing landscape, and there can be a lot of different components involved. So there's written content, there might be audio, video, different multimedias, quizzes, games, and there can be a tendency to get a bit carried away with some of the features that are available and think, oh, this is really cool, it's really whizzy, let's include that in our course. But you're not thinking it through from a localization perspective. So it comes back to the idea that is key for us, is that all of your design and authoring decisions should consider multiple markets and consider things into the future as well. So you might not go into those markets now, but if it's an option, then future-proof your content by making those design decisions with localization in mind. And that's a scenario we come across quite often with clients. They'll have the content, it's been written, it's been in use for years in their English-speaking market, and now they want to localize it. But because it's been designed with just that one market in mind, those decisions haven't been made to enable that content to be done at scale and cost effectively and efficiently.
So it's almost that with every piece of content or every decision you make about an e-learning course, you should have a thought bubble going, and how will this affect localization?
Exactly.
And those decisions are going to be made by multiple people, usually by a whole team of people, because e-learning has so many different bits going into it. How do you manage all of those people and the different stakeholders?
As a localization company, we have experience working with multiple stakeholders. So in a e-learning project, you will have the designers, potentially you will have the client. There could be several vendors who design the e-learning content, and we can work with the different scenarios, and we help those companies get together, discuss as a group all the steps of the process and plan ahead. So from the point of design through localization and the testing, because testing is often the part that e-learning designers forget about. We've done the translation, off it goes, and then you realize there's all kinds of mistakes and issues, or you haven't thought through how you're going to test it and QA it and check if it's actually looks well in the final layout. So we like to think of those things ahead in advance of a project starting. We would collaborate either with a e-learning designer or the company designing the content, and ensure we have scheduled that in the timeline, that there is time to actually carry out the necessary testing, but also find out how we're going to do it. Is it as easy as sending links to the linguists who translate? Do we need to involve the client to sign off on the content, and we have a review round where they actually check all the content? So I think communication is key, and planning and having that kind of overview of the whole process from start to finish, not forgetting all these critical steps which guarantee success at the end.